Hey guys, so in today's video, I wanted to share with you some insights that I've gained from studying Buddhism on the nature of the self. Stay tuned. So one of the things that really seldom comes up in Western philosophy or Western literature, Western religious thinking is the ultimate nature of the self. I think, in the Middle Ages, we came up with this formula of body, mind, and spirit, or body, soul, and spirit, and we've pretty well been content with that ever since. The materialists are even so far as to say that there's really only body, that mind and spirit are just abstract ideas that have no real existence of their own. But this understanding is actually pretty juvenile if you really look at it from the perspective of the East. One of the things I'm deeply critical of in Western science is that we've really only made sincere efforts of understanding the nature of mind, the nature of the self, by looking from the outside in. We take our instruments, our material tools, and we penetrate into the brain and poke and prod inside of the skull to try and ascertain what it is that's really going on in there. Whereas in the East and in the Orient, they've spent thousands of years really treading the opposite direction, coming from the inside out, understanding the nature of mind by going deeper and deeper into the unconscious through altered states of consciousness, and then coming back with observations to reveal to us what's really going on in there. And so I want to take you guys on a mental journey, starting from the outside and going in. And really, when we start to talk about the nature of the self, it's the easiest to simply speak about the body. That's our most immediate sense of self, right? We have our hands, our legs, our arms, so forth, so on, right? But ultimately, we know that's not who we really are. That's not our true self because, well, you can lose a hand and you're still you, right? So the body is clearly there to serve something higher. And so we would look at that and we would say, well, it seems that the self is identified with the brain, right? Everything is moving up to the brain. The brain is the control center. It's ultimately running the show. But there you also run into some problems. Some people that suffer from mental illness, for example, have had half their brain removed and they still remain who they are. In fact, they can lead relatively normal lives.
I have half a brain. When people meet me, they have no idea.
In fact, Vsauce was the first I heard to really pose this question. If you consider removing half of someone's brain and they're still them, what would have happened if you had removed the other half instead? Would they still be them? It's a question of where in the brain does the self live? Well, it seems pretty clear that the self is identified with the entirety of the brain and is not necessarily localized to one individual space. You can have damage to a certain part of the brain and still be you, right? There's this cohesive sense of self that exists within you, and yet when we look at you biologically, we see that in fact you're made of all these different constituent parts. So here we have to leave the confines of the material and venture deeper into the abstract. And so we may turn inward and we may say to ourselves, okay, well, am I my thoughts and feelings? Well, when you look at your feelings, that's clearly not the self, because there are situations and times when you will experience feelings that you don't want to experience. Maybe you've got to give a lecture and you're incredibly nervous and anxious and you don't want to feel that way. And so this feeling is something separate from you. It's come up from the unconscious, it's come up from the instinctual systems of the body, and now you're wrestling with it. Or maybe you have a desire, maybe you're trying to lose weight and you're trying to give up sugar and you just say, oh, I want that donut so bad, right? So clearly feelings, desires, and emotions are ultimately separate from the self. And so you may say, well, I might be my thoughts. In fact, this was Rene Descartes' great conclusion when he said, I think, therefore I am. But there are problems that arise with this as well, because under the influence of certain feelings, you may think things that you don't want to think. Maybe a mental image pops up in your mind and you say, oh, no, that's inappropriate. Or you say to yourself, oh, I shouldn't think that way about somebody, right? So there are these experiences where even our very thoughts seem to be separate from ourselves. And you can really explore this much deeper when you start going into meditation. And in meditation, the ultimate goal is to to separate oneself from their thoughts and to observe the thoughts. So in a meditative state, you're not identifying with the thoughts, you're not running with the thoughts, you're simply in a calm state of mind, watching the mind and observing how these thoughts have their own life.
Because they may think, okay, now my life is good. I'm my precious life. Who cares?
Now, when I first started engaging with meditation, I was really surprised to discover that most of my thoughts, the vast majority of my thoughts, were entirely useless. They were just running around in these completely repetitive patterns, not really accomplishing anything at all. You know, imagining all of these scenarios where I present myself as the great intellectual victor. You know, ultimately, I'm the ultimate authority on life and everything, right? This is the ego, really. And this is where you can really begin to identify the ego. I like to think of the ego as ultimately being a story that you tell yourself. The ego lives in memory. You imagine events from when you were a child and then into your adolescence, and you have this sort of intuitive memory of all the experiences you've been through, and this comes to comprise your notion of self. You say, that's who I really am. But the irony is that when you really analyze memory and when you look closely at it, it's incredibly inaccurate. In fact, I've met people that I had, intimate relationships with as a child, and they'll say, "Oh, do you remember when we did this?" And I'll say, "No, not at all."
Fuck. What?
This kid has issues. We could leave him out here and he would live in the crevasses in the frickin' cliff just to stay out here.
And so this really helps you to recognize that the self, or at least the ego, as far as we recognize it, is a story. It's a story we tell ourselves. And we can see this ego-forming process every time we watch a film. The hero's journey is ultimately the backbone of this ego-forming process. We all have this sort of picture-perfect version of ourselves in our mind, and we see ourselves moving through all of these various scenarios. And so ultimately you begin to recognize that memory, thought, and emotion are all things that the self has access to, but this ultimately does not tell us what the self really is. And this is a major problem. And the more time you spend in meditation, you observe your thoughts, you observe your feelings, and you observe your memories, but then you keep coming back to the question of what is doing the observing? What is this thing that ultimately sees and hears and imagines and it tastes and touches and smells and remembers? What is the ultimate I? You eventually realize that the mind is not a thing, that the self is not a thing. It has no weight, it has no color, it has no height or width or depth. It is not a thing that can be observed directly. It is practically immaterial. It is not something. Rather, the best analogy for the self, the ultimate I, is space itself. The mind is space. It is a space of awareness. If you really stop and think about it, your thoughts exist in a space. Your feelings exist within a space. Your memories exist within a space. And this space that we identify as self is somehow separate from the constituents of the unconscious, because I will have a feeling which suddenly and spontaneously comes up, and I experience this and I have no idea where it came from. Or maybe I'll be reading a book and all of a sudden a memory will come up that I haven't thought about for years. Obviously, the memory was there, living in the depths of the unconscious, but I never had access to it until that moment. And so we recognize that the self is this bubble of awareness that floats in a much wider ocean of unconscious archetypes and instinctual powers.
This gives real happiness. And why? Because mind is like space. It's not a thing, it hasn't been made, born, or created. It won't die, disappear, and fall away again. Therefore, we become fearless.
You got to listen to Under the Skin with Luminary this week. I'm with Westcott Loudon. What did we end up talking about?
Hey guys, just going to be giving a review here of a book called The Way of the Dream.
I bought his book. I was excited about it coming out and everything, and I gotta say, I definitely thoroughly enjoyed it from start to finish.
And it's absolutely a great read. I recommend it for anyone.
I gave it a 5-star rating on Amazon.
And so really, when we want to venture further from here, we have to go deeper and deeper into altered states of consciousness. Now, the Buddhists really recognize this in the form of Buddha nature. And in Buddhism, it's often touted that there is no self. There is no self. And so, in fact, some Buddhists will meditate and repeat this as a mantra: no self, no self, no self, no self, because many religions have recognized that spiritual progress is precipitated on the undermining of the ego, of essentially bursting that bubble of awareness so that it becomes one with a much wider ocean around it. And this is synonymous in many ways with death. And when this condition arises, when the ego is burst, when this little bubble of awareness expands to consume all of the other forces of the unconscious, one begins to identify themselves with the entirety of creation. There is this sense of being one with everything. You often hear the hippies talk about this, right? This is a very distinct and acute experience of the unconscious, wherein which this bubble of awareness, which we crudely identify as the self, is ultimately burst or expanded to include many other powers and forces within the collective unconscious. The important message here, right, is to recognize that the self is largely illusory, that it is this sort of thing that is made up of constituent parts, and because each of those parts is changing all the time, you cannot consistently identify your thoughts, your feelings, your memories, or your body with any concrete notion of self. That ultimately, the only true notion of self, the only lasting sense of self, is the source of mind itself, the awareness and the space that is observing all of these things. But that self is not an individual. That self is identified with the collective. It's identified with the divine, with the mind of all the Buddhas, with God. And so that the self is ultimately an illusion. It's an illusion that is suspended between the divine mind of God, this conscious collective, and the illusory phenomena of memories, dreams, feelings, thoughts, and all these other various parts that we identify with. And ultimately, in death, we are separated from those illusions and called back to that ultimate reality. And as always, guys, thanks for watching.